St. Patrick himself is responsible for the burning of about 150 volumes of old writings that were considered, if you like, in contradiction with the Christian values. And again, it's just unfortunate. That seems to be in the history, not just of the Christian history, but of everybody's history. When the Romans went into Germanic parts of the world, the first thing they did was destroy people's literate history. And they did so in other parts of the world. And that's horrible heritage for us all. There's so much gone. The other problem is because we don't have any way of verifying the veracity and the origin of a lot of what we know. So that has led to a situation where there's quite a divergence of opinion in relation to St. Patrick. On one extreme, there are people who say there never was a St. Patrick. There are people then who say that there were two Patricks. And then there are people who agree with a basic story, a basic history of Patrick, but they use different timelines. And then, of course, there's the church narrative. The church narrative I won't be dealing with because a lot of it, unfortunately, because I suppose of the structure that the church had to put on narratives in the 6th and 7th century. And essentially what they had to do was to make sure that they included things that reflected the stories in the Old Testament in particular. So we had a lot of miracles, we had a lot of strange events that really there's no historical, and at this stage, no reason why they should be believed in. But there's an element of truth within them. But I'm going to give you the history as best as we can. And we're fortunate, there are a couple of documents that were written, we believe were written by St. Patrick himself. And I'm starting off with a line from one of his writings. And it says, "I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many." So reflect on that for a moment, and I'll throw the question out to you now because I'll be answering it as we go through. But why would he have written something that humbled himself so much in that way? And as we go through tonight, I will be helping to clarify that. So we might as well start with his family. When I introduce Patrick at meetings, the first thing I tell people is that Patrick wasn't Irish and his name wasn't Patrick. So who was he? Well, his name was Maewyn Sakat, and he has an additional name, Patricius, and he got that because after entering into the church, and at a certain level within the church, you became a member of the Roman patrician order, and so you were allowed then essentially to call yourself that. So that's where the Patricius, from which we get Patrick. Now, he was from a Romano-British Christian missionary family. And when he did come to Ireland with people, what essentially we had was a British missionary group coming to Ireland. He's known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he's the primary patron saint of Ireland, along with Saints Bridget and Columba, or sometimes called Columkill. So where was he born? And again, there's a lot of debate on that. Also, there's debate about the year, but I believe it was around 385. Probably in Kilpatrick, near Dumbarton in Scotland. There are lots of people who want it to be Wales. He tells us in his own writing that he gives us the name of the village or the community, and was Banaventa Bernaye. But no one has been able to track that down on old maps and establish an exact location for it. He tells us in his own writings who his parents were. They were Calpurnius and Conchessa, and they were part of a wealthy Romano-British community, and they were living in Britain, and they were in charge of the colonies because the Romans had taken over the island of Britain around midway through the 1st century. And there was always a colony of administrators and military people. And just, it was also a place for people who were retiring. There was a lot of retired people from Rome coming over because they were being offered and given some nice land. So his father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest. So church was in the family. Also, there's evidence that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland, and I'll be doing a little bit about that later on, but I do a whole separate presentation on the family, and I include within the family his siblings, his nephews and nieces, and also the woman that some people say he was married to, Sheila. St. Sheila's Day is the day after St. Patrick's Day. And for a long, long time, they were celebrated as one day, literally, in celebrations that went over to two. And today, they're really only celebrated in places like Newfoundland and Australia, where the tradition remains. Unfortunately, in Ireland, because of the issue of celibacy, it wouldn't be seen as appropriate for people to be thinking that Patrick might have actually had a woman. Now, some of his relatives were St. Mel of Ardagh and his brothers, Melchu, Munis, and Riach, and they are said to have actually accompanied Patrick when he arrived. His most famous sister is Darerca, and she's known as the mother of saints because most of her children, 17 sons and 2 daughters, entered religious life, and many were later recognized as saints. Several of her sons were bishops. She's honoured today in Ireland on the 22nd of March, coming up soon, and she's the patroness of Valentia Island, which is off the coast of County Kerry. A little bit about St. Mel, because it helped me to introduce some other issues here. Now, Mel, who was his nephew, helped evangelize Ireland. And what was critical about him was he did so while supporting himself through manual labour. He was one of those parts of the Christian community who essentially aligned himself with the old, if you like, tradition within the church, the early church tradition, because during the 3rd and 4th century, Rome essentially became the headquarters of the church, and the Roman church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And at that stage, then, the church became basically was run by the elites within the Roman Empire. Now, there were people like Mel who did not like that and basically saw it from his point of view, it wasn't right. People should live off the people. So he was one of those people who would never do that. So he worked and supported himself. Patrick appointed him as one of the earliest Irish bishops and head of the Diocese of Ardagh. And he also was involved in the building of the monastery of Ardagh, and he was both bishop and abbot there. And one of the most relevant things about St. Mel was that it was Mel who accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun and served as her mentor while she was in Ardagh. Now, under the old Gaelic society in Ireland, women had lots of rights, much more rights than they had under either English rule in Ireland and certainly under the years after Christianity got established. Although in Ireland we had a particular variant, we had what some people call Celtic Christianity, others call it even Patrick's Christianity, and within it, women had rights that weren't generalized throughout the Christian world. And that continued with St. Bridget because she was actually made a bishop by St. Mel. And he made a mistake because what he did was he read if you like, when somebody is being made, if you like, an officer of the church, you read out, certain things to them. He wrote out the one, essentially the vows for the bishop. Now, Bridget wouldn't have known that. And when it was pointed out to him, his response was, well, if I did that, it wasn't anything to do with me. That was God directly intervening and making sure that I did that. And there is no way that I'm going to go and undo what God must have intended me to do. So St. Bridget, she then was in a situation where she was a bishop. And then there was, for the next literally 600 to 700 years, there was a woman abbot from Kildare would always be at the synods of the church. And that continued until the year 1172. After the Norman invasion of Ireland, a representative of the Pope came to Ireland, convened a meeting, and one of the first things that they did away with was the role and the presence of a woman at those male-only meetings. Mel, a little bit more about him. His feast day is February the 7th. It's observed as a holiday for single people, and it's a day for singles to celebrate the good things about being single. And as you can imagine, the traditions include sending yourself a St. Mel's Day card and hosting a party for your single friends. And as I said, there's a lot more to the story of the family, but that's for another day. So let's look down at Patrick and his early years when he ended up in Ireland as a slave. And after 6 years, then he managed to escape. And again, we know this because he wrote about it. And there's a part, as I said, from some extreme views that, and essentially what those who say there was no Patrick, what they say is that around the 6th, 7th century, if you like, the leaders of the Roman Church in Ireland needed to have an origin story. And they created an origin story that had to have a central character. And so they created this Patrick. They can sustain that argument, but no one really believes it, and I certainly don't believe it either. So according to the writings of St. Patrick, at the age of 16, it doesn't give us the exact date, because obviously in those days there was different calendars and all sorts of things, but now on the calendar that we have today, the Gregorian calendar, in his day, it would have been the Julian calendar or some other local calendar, but it was 403 AD, and he was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain, and he was sent to Ireland to serve as a slave, herding and tending sheep in Dalriada. So how was he captured by Irish pirates? What was going on? Well, think about it for a minute. Who were the main people in Ireland at this time? They were the Celts. Where did the Celts come from? Well, the Celts came from the continent. And why did they come? Well, many of them came because they were forced out of their homes and lands in Europe by the Romans during the period of the Roman Empire. The Celts had their own empire that predated the Roman Empire. But eventually when the Roman Empire emerged and got strong, the Celts were defeated and many of them had to leave. And some of them came to Ireland. So they knew about the Romans, and the one thing they didn't want was the Romans coming and taking over Ireland. So their strategy essentially was to harass the Romans on the island of Britain and on the west coast of Europe. So they would have these groups going off to destabilize Romano-British communities. And it was on a raid like that they captured. And Patrick himself mentions that there were thousands of people captured. So he was one of the ones, and a number of his family. It is thought that one of his brothers got killed during that raid. But anyway, that's how he came to Ireland. And the High King of Ireland at the time was Niall of the Nine Hostages. So he was owned then by Rí means king. So it was a King Miliach MacBain, and he ruled some hills of Antrim between Lough Neagh and Slieve Mish. Patrick himself tells us, and I think you can understand this quite well yourself, if you were on the hills in Ireland when it's cold, damp, lonely, whatever, he says he began to pray. And in his writings, then he tells us that he had never before paid much attention to the teachings. And in fact, he tells us that he didn't really believe in God and that he found priests foolish, even given his own family's connections. And that's a photograph of Slievemish, where he was. So he's the legendary first known Irish home. And according to legend, and sometimes we can bend that a little bit to mean, history, because that's the issue. The issue is that even his own writings that I'm referring to here, they don't survive. What we have is ones that were written in the 7th century. We're not too sure if they were written from original copies, but certainly the original copies don't survive, or whether they were written from, because people were very good at the time of remembering word for word, because in the oral tradition, people could do that. So anyway, he was brought to Ireland. He worked then as a shepherd for 6 years, from the ages of 16 to 22. Think for a moment, if you had to work as a slave from the age of 16 to 22 today, wouldn't you miss the most important years of your education? You would. And it was the same with him. I mean, he wasn't any, ordinary person. He came from a wealthy Romano-British family, and he would have been in schools and colleges. So he missed out on all of that. And the reason why I'm saying that right now is that if you wanted to have a career within the church, even today, and even way back then, you had to have a good education. And this was one of the things then that created major problems for him later on when he decided he wanted a career in the church, because he had missed out on so much of his education. They didn't want him to have a meaningful career, and certainly didn't want him to be either a priest or a bishop, in the early stages anyway. He tells us that he endured those 6 years in cold weather and isolation. Now, then we get into this area again of legend, of history, and of narrative. Now, from the Christian church's narrative, this is what we're told. We're told that he had this outer worldly experience. A mysterious voice said to him, "Your hungers are rewarded, you are going home." And we know that he walked quite a distance to the East Coast, around 200 miles. Now, again, the reason why this makes sense that this was the Christian narrative is because this kind of thing about talking about otherworldly experiences, God coming to you in your sleep and telling you things, this is certainly in line with a lot of the Christian narratives and in the origin stories that we get, which generally reflects phenomenon that were, part of the writing of the Old Testament. So he was a fugitive slave. He was never intercepted, stopped, or otherwise approached. An almost impossible achievement. Now, in his work, the way he explains it is that I came in God's strength and had nothing to fear, but it doesn't tell us anything, really. Now, it's probably likely that for him to get 200 miles in Ireland, that he had to have support. And we know that at the time, there were people in Ireland whose job essentially was to deal with issues involving slaves. Because if you were captured as a slave in Britain or on the continent, and if you were a wealthy person, well, then somebody would be sent over to Ireland offering a ransom. And one of the reasons why they kidnapped people as slaves was so that they would get these ransoms. So there was a network in Ireland. And even though I can't support it, I believe that there was a network and that he got help from that, something we would understand in this country as an underground railroad. What's for sure is that in the 6 years he was here, he learned a lot. He became fluent, or at least could speak the Irish language well. He learned of the Irish culture and history, and he developed an affinity towards the people of Ireland. And essentially, these were key aspects that he was able to, if you like, in modern day parlance, put into his CV. And when it came to crunch time about insisting that he be sent to Ireland, a lot of the decision to send him there would have come down to this, because there were not too many people. First of all, the issue would have been who would want to go to Ireland, because Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire, and the essential, if you like, strategy of the church was to spread it within the parts of the world that was part of the old Roman Empire. And also, we know that from stories that were written, everyone feared Ireland and places like it. First of all, they didn't understand it, didn't understand the people. So not many of them would have wanted to step on an island and try to persuade people, particularly people that they wouldn't even be able to communicate with, because they didn't understand their language, or didn't understand their culture and whatever. But Patrick had enough to be able to, I suppose, get a start on that. So he left Ireland, we know, on a ship that was loading cargo of Irish hounds for sale on the continent. At this time, Irish wolfhounds and various other hounds were very sought after in Europe and fetched an enormous amount of money. Now, Patrick, he tells us himself, he approached the captain, he was turned away, he walked away. He was worried that he could be apprehended at any moment, because all someone had to say was draw attention to the fact that he was a slave. It must have been quite obvious that he was. But he tells us then that he heard some sailors shouting, "Come on board, we'll take you in trust." He probably got on board because he was able to convince them that, having spent a lot of time where he was, and he worked with dogs, obviously, you can't be a shepherd and not work with dogs. So he probably used the fact that he had certain skills to get on. He tells us that they traveled for 3 days, and what they found was devastation. Now, that was probably the result of because at the time, the Roman Empire was in decline, was in terminal decline. And around that time, the rivers, particularly the River Rhine, froze. That meant that people were able to move, from northern and eastern Europe into Western Europe. And we know that hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of Germanic peoples were fleeing the Huns, Attila the Hun and his people, and they crossed the frozen Rhine and they invaded Gaul. Now, at the time, Gaul was a Christian part of Europe. And when Patrick arrived there, the place was deserted and in terrible state. So a lot of people that were there had left, obviously. Not everybody was killed. And some of those people arrived in Ireland, some of them as refugees, some of them as asylum seekers. And they made up a population in Ireland that were Christians and had skills and had resources. And all of that contributed to the 300 years in Ireland, where we were known as the island of saints and scholars, because we had so much going on in Ireland, while the rest of Europe was literally in ruin. So he says that he walked for 2 weeks and finding nothing to eat. The captain taunted him because the captain knew he was a Christian. And he says, "How about a Christian? You say your God is all powerful." And then in the narrative, the Christian narrative, it says, Patrick turned to him and said, "From the bottom of your heart, turn trustingly to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible to him." We're told that the sailors bowed their heads in supplication, and then just then they heard a stampede of a herd of pigs, and they were able to eat and feed the dogs, because there was no way they were going to eat dogs, to kill a dog and eat it, because the dogs were more valuable than they were. Now, this again is an indication of, again, a Christian narrative. Somebody wanted, to portray it this way. But the story is he did accompany them, and he left them. So he would have had two choices. He would have had a choice to turn around and go back over all that wasteland on his own, or he could have gone around the coast. And I believe he went around the coast. And it so happens around that time we had an event going on. The abbot Honoratus, he was constructing a monastery on the island of Lérins, which is modern-day Cannes, where the International Film Festival is held today. Now, the reason he was able to get the land was because literally nobody else wanted it, because it was full of snakes. There's a woman who has written a book about the area, and she writes, Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. And she writes in her book, it is not impossible or unreasonable to assume that he, Patrick, might have sought refuge on Lairns. So my take is that he obviously had to work his way around. There was no office in those days where you could go and get food and money to live on. So he had to work, and because of his Christian background, this project would have appealed to him. It was dangerous work. And I think what happened, because you know about the story of Patrick supposedly getting rid of snakes in Ireland. Well, we know that that's not true, but he probably was on Lairns and was involved there in getting rid of snakes from Lairns. So I think what happened was in later years when he was in Ireland and after a day's work, when everybody would be sitting down, having a meal, talking and having, beer, because part of his entourage included a brewer, because people weren't going to work unless they had some brewer among the crew. So probably at some point he would have been telling people about his time there. And over time, you know, the way stories end up, they start one spot and then they end up, as we have today, with people believing that he drove the snakes literally out of Ireland. So he got home, we know that, and he tells us in these letters a few years later, it was again with his parents to welcome him back, and they pleaded with him not to leave, etc., etc. But he tells us that he had discovered God while in Ireland, and he began to work towards a future in the Roman Church. And he tells us that his life was changed forever. So at some point then, the reason that he decided to come back to Ireland, and this again is the what's given to us in the narrative, the Christian narrative about him. And this section, if you like, is called The Voice of the Irish. So this is what he says. I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus. And we know that he knew a person called Victoricus. And he carried many letters. And he gave me one of them. And I read the heading, The Voice of the Irish. And then he tells us, as I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Vaucluse, which is beside the Western Sea. And they cried out as with one voice, we appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us. So in terms of generating an explanation for why he wanted to come to Ireland, this is what we've got. Now, whether this is, again, a narrative that was generated, maybe it was generated, because we know he wanted to come back to Ireland. We know that for sure. But anyway, that's what we're told. Let's have a look now at the Christianity and Ireland. So today, if you go to Ireland and you ask, people about the Christian church, you'll essentially be told, unless somebody knows their history, essentially you'll be told that there was no Christians in Ireland before the arrival of St. Patrick and his missionaries. Now we know that that's not true, but the issue that you're facing here is that there were many, many divisions, within the early Christian church, and by the time that the Roman Empire accepted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, at that stage, then the various groups within the church, within the Christian community, they were given the option, come under the guidance and leadership of the Roman Church, or you have no role to play. Problem was, many of them were not happy to do that. So then they were expelled, excommunicated, and they were labeled as heretics. And heretics are seen as worse than pagans. So essentially what you're being told is that the people who call themselves Christians who were in Ireland before the arrival of St. Patrick, they were heretics. They call themselves Christians, but they weren't. That's the kind of nonsense that you get. So just a couple of things that we know. We know that, it is said that St. James visited Ireland in the 1st century, and that on leaving Ireland, he left behind an organization to spread the religion. And he left it in charge of his father, Zebedee. And if any of you ever spent time in Ireland, you will even hear people still today talk about Zebedee. Now, the other thing that's critical to understand early Irish Christianity was that it developed from the teachings of St. John. And then he spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. So it was that route that Christianity came to Ireland. Now, there were differences in liturgy, there were differences in practice from that of from the Saints Peter and Paul, who were Roman based. Just two of those. And we know from Irish history that the issue of the dating of Easter, that was something that didn't get resolved for about 500 years, because in Ireland, the tradition was with St. John. When Patrick came with the Roman view of the world, he tried to persuade people to adopt a different view, but that took hundreds of years to happen. There were other things like the type of haircut. The haircut that the early Christians in Ireland had was different from the Roman. The Roman haircut essentially was that cutting that patch on the top of your head, whereas the Romans, they had long hair and they cut their fringe. So again, that had to be changed, but it took a long time for that to be changed. Now, there's other evidence from legends and annals. Annals are records that were kept in Ireland, essentially like a diary. One of them involves Cormac MacNessa, who was a king in Ireland around the time of Christ. And there's a story that one of his military commanders was in Rome the day that Jesus was crucified. What the Romans did that day was that they brought out a representative from every nation. And some of those were people who were captured prisoners. Others were people who, I suppose, had embassy status or whatever you might call it today. But so they were there. And what happened then was, for whatever reason, his military commander made it back to Ireland. And then he was telling the king about what happened. And the king had some prior knowledge of Jesus Christ and was so upset about what happened and the story that what happened that he got up out of his seat and essentially started ranting and raving. He ran outside. Problem for him was that at some point in his life, he'd had a piece of shrapnel go into his brain and it became loose. And so he died of a brain bleed. So that's how we know about him, because he was an important king. A few hundred years later, other evidence about Christianity comes from another king, Cormac MacArt. Now, he was killed by the Druids. And the reason he was killed was because he had converted to Christianity. Now, we're talking about 366. That's about 70 years before Patrick came to Ireland. And then even other kind of evidence that you can pick up. Who are the most famous names for boys in Ireland? Well, it's Sean and Seamus. It's not Paul and Peter. Sean and Seamus, they translate into John and James. Now, we also know, and this isn't disputed, that before Patrick arrived, when he arrived, there were already a number of Irish Christian leaders there, like Albie, Declan, Kieran, Ibarus, all of whom were later elevated as saints. Now, they were not happy about the fact that somebody was coming in from abroad to take over leadership and tell them what to do. So Patrick was essentially restricted to certain parts of the country. And if he wanted to go to areas that were under the control of these leaders, he had to get their permission to do so. And that kind of changed over time, because obviously his status rose as things developed in Ireland and as the religion spread quicker and as his work produced results. But initially, there was a lot of opposition to it from people within the church. Now, some of it has to do, again, with the relationship of Ireland to the Roman Empire. One of them I said to you a moment ago about the fact that the Celts in Ireland had a history whereby they had been forced out of their homes in Europe by the Romans. So they were not that anxious to see Ireland, either, if you like, come under the control of somebody from Rome, either through a back door or a front door. They didn't want it either way. And we know that Ireland had been fighting against the Roman Empire through alliances in northern Britain, Gaul, and even North Africa for centuries. Now, just to get into the issue that I raised about the Roman Church becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Well, essentially what happened was that the first few centuries, there was, we know Christians were persecuted And from around the year 250, the persecution became empire-wide, and it was a terrible time if you were a Christian. Now, Constantine ended that when he became emperor of Rome in 313. Now, Constantine he had been operating in Britain, and he had been chosen as the emperor on the field by his soldiers in battle. And that sometimes happened because what happens is soldiers who are out in the field, a lot of the time, do not like the way that they are, if you like, treated, and the way that the support that they get from central Rome. And occasionally, Constantine wasn't the first or the last general to be declared an emperor on the field. Now, if you got declared an emperor on the field and you wanted to go with that, but then you had to go the whole way, which meant you had to get to Rome and you had to defeat the incumbents or anybody else who wanted to challenge you. So the issue then is, how was he able to do that? Well, my take on it is that he was coming from Britain, which was Christian at the time, and he was going to be passing through Gaul, which was Christian. The Christians up to this stage had a history of not getting involved in wars. They had refused, for instance, to get involved in and support the Jews in their wars with the Romans. So something must have happened. And what I believe happened was that because of the persecution, Constantine made a promise to Christians: if you come and fight with me and for me, that if we win, we will end the persecution. And I believe that that's what happened. So that was, around 313, he introduced the first legislation that decriminalized Christianity. And then over the century, then things changed to the point that by the end, by 380, it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire by Emperor Theodosius. Now, in the 390s, there was a comeback by the pagans, but there was a final victory in the 390s in a battle which the Christians won against the pagans, and that really was the last attempt by the pagans to retake Rome. In terms of a timescale, Patrick was born in this period. He was born in 386, around the time that Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. At this stage, Rome was in decline. And then in the year 410, Rome was sacked by the Germans, and they had to withdraw their troops from Britain. And that was the last time. Soldiers had been withdrawn over the previous centuries, at times when Rome was under threat, but they always returned. This time they didn't. And then in 476, Odoacer, he forced Romulus Augustus, who was the last Western Roman emperor, to abdicate. Now, in 380, the Edict of Thessalonica, it made Nicene Christianity the state church of the Roman Empire. Now, what was Nicene Christianity? Well, when Constantine took over, he wanted to unify the different groups within the church. So he called a synod in 325 at a place called Nicene. And the agreements that were reached at that then became the foundations for the Roman Church. And at that time, they just called it the Nicene Church or Nicene Christianity. And at that stage, essentially, if you weren't prepared to go along with what was agreed by the majority there, well, then you could no longer remain part of the Christian community, and you could lose everything. People lost their lives, people lost their property. So the term Catholic, then meaning universal, was associated then to the religion by the emperor. And that provided the impetus for church leaders in Rome to assert their dominance over the various branches of the church around the world. Now, and again, there's a lot of history that I can't go into here. I'm just kind of introducing it to you. Now, the significant event that happened then, because Patrick came in 432. In 429, the Pope then sent St. Germanus to Britain to ensure compliance with Roman authority, because even after the Nicene Synod, there were still divisions within the church. So Rome had to assert its dominance. So sent St. Germanus over to Britain. And what he did was he said, he got agreement by the majority that they would go along with the orthodoxy from Rome. But there were lots of others who were not prepared to do that. They then were exiled. And of course, where did they go? Well, a lot of them came to Ireland. So now, from the things I've been telling you, in over the last 20 minutes or so, we've seen that, in Europe, because of the Germanic tribes invading the Christian parts of Western Europe, you had a lot of Christians arriving in Ireland as refugees, asylum seekers. Then, now in 429, as a result of the work of Saint Germanus, you had a lot of Christians arriving in Ireland. And then, of course, the Irish, in terms of their raids against the Roman, the Roman communities, they were raiding and taking Christians, because when they raided Britain or Gaul to destabilize the Roman communities there, the prisoners that they took, many of them, if not most of them, were Christian. So you can see now you have this issue. You have a lot of Christians in Ireland. So Rome is getting concerned. So it has to do something. And that's essentially the background of why Patrick arrived in Ireland, because he came to Ireland to do a job. And that was to establish the control of the Roman Church over all the diverse Christians that had arrived in Ireland. So as I said, some of the slaves brought to Ireland, they were Christians. Irish mercenary soldiers also may have converted while away fighting, and then some of them may have brought home families or spouses. Then there was traders. There was always a lot of trade going on, and there were free people in Ireland who had converted. And then there was Irish people then that had been converted by the missionaries. And then, of course, you had all those refugees and asylum seekers. So that gives you an idea of the collection of Christians that were in Ireland around the time that Patrick arrived. So now we'll have a look at how he converted. A couple of things that we want to look at, because obviously it wasn't going to be an easy job. And he tells us that. He says, daily I am expecting to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery. And he, in fact, tells us that I think there was 12 or 16 attempts on his life. You probably all have heard of Cardinal Cushing. And he has kind of summarized for me here what I've been trying to get across to you. So he says, it was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and chaos. I can't actually read the whole lines here because I've got that bar on my screen. But anyway, what was his role? Well, Patrick wasn't the first choice to go. In fact, they didn't want Patrick coming to Ireland. And if you ever get a chance, at the end, I'll be showing you a movie that was made, I think it was 1999, and it actually covers this aspect quite well. You know, the issues going on about Patrick's, if you like, persistence at being made a priest and a bishop and being sent to Ireland. But a year before Patrick arrived, the Pope sent Palladius, and that mission failed. And Patrick then was sent to replace him. And Palladius was the wrong man for the job, as you would see in that movie. You know, he was used to being looked after and cared for and sitting down at a table and being fed and drinking wine and whatever. And the movie has got this wonderful scene where he arrives on the coast of Ireland in his finery, and he's kind of walking in, and he can see his sandals getting mucked and getting dirt on the end of his gowns and whatever, and everyone is laughing at him. So anyway, Patrick's role, as was Palladius's, the primary role was to align the Christian community in Ireland with Rome. What we're told in the texts in Ireland, the Christian texts, is that he was sent to Ireland to strengthen the local Christian community. Same thing. And as I said, the community was a mix. Now, Patrick arrived in Ireland when he was about 47. He was 22, when he escaped from Ireland. So there was a lot of time in between where he spent training. So he spent about 20 years preparing. Now, because he'd missed out on all those years in education and getting all the skills in everything from oratorical skills, and particularly with the language, Latin, you had to be an expert in the language, in Latin, and he wasn't. So he was initially confined to the role as a brother. He was finally made a priest and then made a bishop. as he successfully pleaded his case to be sent to Ireland. And essentially, what happened was because the mission of Palladius failed, there was nobody else who really wanted to come to Ireland. So he was able to make a strong case for himself. And it was one of those cases, we have to send somebody. There's no one else. So he also had another issue that he had to deal with. As I said a few moments ago, the Pope had sent St. Germanus over a few years before Patrick arrived to Britain. And so in order for the British to agree to accept the orthodoxy of Rome, there were quid pro quos. And one of the quid pro quos was that Britain would have a veto, if you like, or would have to give approval to anybody who was going to be promoted or anybody who was going to go to places like Ireland. Had to come through them. And they were not happy to do that. But because of the deal that had been done, they couldn't really say no, but they weren't happy about it. And we'll be coming back to that later on, because that was not a good start for Patrick. Now, Cardinal Cushing gives us some interesting information. He says that Patrick had a retinue, and when he went into a community, he brought with him never less than about 24, often up to 100. And these are the kind of people that were involved. There was usually an assistant bishop, chaplain, several young men who were preparing for the priesthood, a brehon, which is the old Irish word for judge, who advised him on legal matters. There was builders, masons, smiths, metal workers, chariot and wagon workers, a cook, a brewer, and table attendants. And besides them, there was the sacristan, the 3 embroidery workers, and a palmist who was going to be the custodian of the sacred books. Now, there's some speculation that Patrick may have supplemented his church resources with some personal family wealth because he came from a wealthy background. But what's more significant is that wealthy Irish nobility, particularly women, provided many of the resources that he needed. The 2 groups of people that traditionally welcomed Christianity in the early days were slaves and women, because it offered them an alternative to the life that they had endured, I suppose is as good a word as any. Now, for women in Ireland, they, first of all, pre-Christian, and the ones that Patrick would have been coming across with, who still in the early days weren't Christian, they had rights under the old brehon laws in Ireland. Part of that right was that their wealth was their own. They couldn't be taken from them. Not like under English law, when you got married to a man, you lost everything. So women still retained their wealth, and that couldn't be taken from them. Problem for a lot of them was that they were going to be forced into marriages which they had no interest in. Usually there were marriages involving boundary disputes, wars, things that really they didn't, it wasn't what they wanted to do. And of course, the other side of that then was that once they got married, then they were in what they described as perpetual pregnancy, permanent pregnancy until you could no longer get pregnant or until you died or whatever. So they were looking for a way out. So a lot of these women decided that they were going to become brides of Christ. So there was this whole phenomenon about being married to Christ, and being married to Christ then meant that you had a legitimate reason for refusing your father's request or demand or order or whatever to go and marry somebody. And that's what they did. A great personal sacrifice. But that was what they sought out in the new religion, this freedom. There's various people who have written books about Ireland, about Christianity. One of them you might have come across by Cahill, which is How the Irish Saved Civilization. But he tells us about Patrick's mission. It says, because of his knowledge of the Irish language and culture, he was sent to provide support for the Christian slaves and converts, starting in Northern Ireland. And when he's talking about Northern Ireland, he's talking about the northern half of Ireland. He tells us that Patrick would have sought permission from local kings to minister to Christians in a given area. And that's something that Patrick would have learned the time he was in Ireland. that was the way to go about it. There was protocols, there was a way to get things done. Also, he would have sought assistance of local kings to move beyond tribal borders using connections. And of course, he converted some kings, and that made things easier. At this time, there would have been probably about 150 to 200 kings in Ireland of different layers. Another book that was written by a guy called Freeman, he suggests that Patrick succeeded by using a slow and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. And one of those practical politics, he even tells us himself in his own written works. He says he made payments to local kings to gain their favor and protection. Now, while this was political and while it worked, this was something that the British ecclesiastical authorities had major problems with. And it wasn't that they were immune from paying people to get things done. The problem for them was that they, and one of their big issues with Patrick was they wanted a bigger slice of the money that was coming in to Ireland, and they wanted a greater accountability, is the way they would put it, from Patrick, because as far as they were concerned, they were in charge of him. But he didn't really see it that way. He wanted to build the church in Ireland, and he was going to use the resources of the Irish people, if they gave it, those resources, to do that, not to send it back to England. And in fact, there's an interesting scene in that movie I referred to when he's cleaning out, pigs in this pigsty, and these two men appear and introduce themselves, and he just comes out and he says, "Oh, wonderful, wonderful! I've been looking for help, and I've been sending messages for so long, and at last you're here." And the guy's turn around and says, "No, we're here to do an audit." He didn't give them much time. But what is clear is that he chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic, and that worked. And also, the way he saw it was that he had to demonstrate that Christian morality and principles, he wanted to demonstrate that worked, but he also wanted to demonstrate that in the way that he approached his work. He wanted to be able to, as they say, walk the talk. Now, it's understood that Patrick, along with other missionaries, they managed to spread the Christian teachings far and wide. They did that through preaching, writing, performing countless baptisms. Now, that was aided by the fact that the pagan religions already related to transcendentalism. So you didn't have to, to do too much convincing of people to talk about, a life hereafter and spirits and whatever. They already understood a lot of that. Patrick recognized the history of spiritual practice in place in Ireland, the nature-oriented pagan rituals, and all of those were incorporated into church practices. He didn't do what some Christians in other countries did, which was basically to tell people you have to forget everything, do away with everything, all your traditions, are going to change. He incorporated, and nothing better than the Celtic cross that's associated with Patrick. He's renowned for coming up with the Celtic cross, which combined a native sun-worshipping ideology with that of the Christian cross. The images on that show that. Quick look at his achievements. Well, we know he established bishops throughout northern, central, and eastern Ireland. He structured the church by locating bishops close to the sites of provincial kings, and the borders then of dioceses were arranged to correspond with the boundaries of petty kingdoms. Now, this wasn't exactly the way it was supposed to be done. The Roman Church wanted the country to be divided into dioceses, but Patrick wasn't able to achieve that. Essentially, the clan system in Ireland was such that if you want to work with me and my clan, and he really had no choice but to do that. He couldn't work with different ones at the same time. So they all wanted, if they were going to transfer, to have their own church. And essentially what happened was that the Druids and the pagan priests that they had then became the priests within Patrick's church. And because under the old Irish society, they were all occupying hereditary positions under the Christian church, the early Christian church in Ireland, they also became hereditary positions. And these were, again, these continued for a long time. And again, I mentioned a synod in the year 1172 when Bridget's and her tradition was taken away. in 1172 as well, it was again any issues surrounding hereditary positions, was taken away. You now could not use that as a way, if you like, to enter the church. Patrick was the highest ranking bishop in Ireland. He chose Armagh, Armagh being the capital of Ulster at the time. It was the logical place for him to set up. And then he made Latin the ecclesiastical language of Ireland. And that worked in a sense because Latin was always the language of trade throughout Europe. Because if you were trying to develop trading links or trying to sell things at a port, you had to be able to communicate. And a lot of people didn't have the local languages. So you always had to have some people there who spoke Latin. So business was conducted in Latin. And in fact, Latin has always been, even up to the time that I was in school, a lot of people were still learning Latin. In terms of these achievements, also one of the things that's interesting is that there were no church martyrs from the time. And in a way, that indicates that the pagan rulers allowed him to carry out his mission. Now, we do know from his confessio, because we're told that in his words, for on more than one occasion, he alludes to persecution. He declares that he expects martyrdom and he welcomes the prospect. He mentions about 12 or 16 attempts on his life. But they didn't get him, which they could have done if they were serious about it. Now, by the time of his death, he, contrary to the Christian narrative, because he was only in Ireland for about 25 years. So by the time he said he had not succeeded in converting the whole of Ireland, nor in entirely reconciling the ancient traditions with Christianity. Now, through his missionary work, he supported church officials, he created councils, he founded monasteries, organized Ireland into dioceses, albeit along the existing lines of demarcation within Ireland. And just one example of that was in the 6th century, the following century, there were laws that were laid down, and they laid down a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbors. In other words, you were not to force people to convert. You had to demonstrate, the superiority of your beliefs, and that was the way to do it. You couldn't force people, and you certainly couldn't harass them into becoming Christians. Cardinal Cushing tells us a few things. He says the whole island was Catholic by the end of the 25 years, which isn't the case. The other things there's not much disagreement over. He consecrated 350 bishops, ordained over 5,000 priests, and built more than 700 churches. So again, we know that in Ireland, we had this 300 years before the Vikings came, where Ireland was the island of saints and scholars, where there was amazing things going on. And a lot of it started off here. A lot of it started off, because you can imagine 700 churches. That was a lot of laborers and a lot of builders and skills and materials. So that in itself would have started off a big boom. Now, let's have a look a little bit more detailed then on the writings of St. Patrick. There's two of them. The first one that was written was a letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, Coroticus was a king, a Christian king on the island of Britain. And what happened was Patrick had just been on the northeast coast of Ireland, and he had just baptized the whole community. And he left to go to repeat that in another community. And shortly afterwards, a person catches up with them and with the news that that community had been taken away, had been raided by Coroticus, and people had been taken away to England as slaves. So Patrick had to do something, partly because at this stage in Ireland, he still hadn't, he was still fighting, to convince people that he had something. There was a lot of people in Ireland who were just waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to fall flat on his face at some point or other. So Patrick saw this as a real challenge. He had to respond to this in a way that convinced the people of Ireland that he was on their side, and also that he did everything possible to secure the release of the people. And unfortunately, in doing that, he had to go against some of the protocols that were in place in the church at the time. And that started off a spiral in terms of his relationship with the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain. Essentially, they wanted to remove Patrick. And the second thing that he wrote, I'll be coming to in a moment, is connected. Now, the letter itself has been described as it was a decree of excommunication, because he was basically saying that the king, should be excommunicated unless he did something. Now, what that meant, in effect, was if the king could be excommunicated, well, then there was no way his soldiers could take commands from him. So he wasn't talking about excommunicating the soldiers. He was looking for the king to be excommunicated. It was a heartfelt plea, a carefully argued sermon, a word of comfort to his Irish followers, and a powerful prayer to God for divine justice. So he was looking to achieve quite a number of things there. Copies of it were sent to Coroticus, as well as to the church leaders in Britain, and obviously around Ireland itself. We don't exactly know what happened. Patrick knew that if he didn't do something, that all those people would end up on the slave market within Europe within a very short period of time, and that they then could end up anywhere from China to God knows where, in the world, that the slave market would bring them to. And there would be, so he felt he had to try to get them released while they were still together as a group, because once they got separated and sold, there was no way. So he felt he had to respond straight away. Problem was, and also he realized as well that even if the British bishops did try to get onto Coroticus, he felt that it was quite likely that those bishops, because it would be the bishops in the local area that would have to approach Coroticus, and Patrick believed that those people probably were already committed in some way to Coroticus and would do very little in any event. So he felt he had to do that. But the wrath of the British ecclesiastical authorities came down on him for that. So over the next number of years, then, they were trying to reel him in, essentially, and they wanted to remove him. Now, eventually, he was called for a review. And we all know she called for a review. So Patrick knew. So he refused to go for that review, and instead he wrote a letter, and that's what this is about, the Confessio, or it's what's known as the Confessio. It's the closest thing to an autobiography. The document was a letter, so it didn't have a title. It got the letter from the last words, the final line of the letter, because he says in it that this is his Confessio before death. He was in his early 70s at that time. Now, the reason he wrote it, again, the British Church were angry over his letter, called back for a review. His character and work were being attacked. He was accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland in the first place. And of course, he was stated to be unfit for the job, going back to his education, and also probably to the way that he managed to convince some of the superiors to allow him to come to Ireland. And of course, he was seen as having gone native. He was too close to the Irish. They were using terms like, they're calling him a filthy little pig keeper. That was one of the things. Now, the Confessio itself, this is how it was described by one writer. It's a selective story. It's designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish. He goes through his boyhood, slavery, escapes, dreams, threats, temptations, etc. They were all included in to convince the readers that he, like Paul, was selected by God and guided by him. This is, and I believe that this here is likely to be what Patrick would have put in. I don't believe that somebody writing an origin story would have been able to capture what's in this. And this really gets to the point. He says, "Listen to me well, all of you, great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners, so proud of your education," because they had been getting onto him about his lack of education. He says, "Listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence. He picked ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forth with fear and reverence, and without any of you complaining at the time, to serve the Irish faithfully. That last piece, what he's getting at there is that they didn't put up much resistance to him coming, although they did make it clear that they weren't happy. But the reality was they didn't expect him to succeed, first of all. In fact, they didn't think he would last very long, that he would either, like his predecessor, give up within a short period of time, or worse still, that the Irish would dispose of him. Well, he died eventually at a place that's now called Downpatrick after him. It wasn't called Downpatrick for, let's see, 700 or 800 years after Patrick died. And that was where he built his first church. And it is said that he's buried there alongside St. Bridget and St. Columba. So a quick look at some St. Patrick's Day celebrations. In terms of his legacy, that's what we have. And so it has endured right up to right now. The fact that I'm here talking to you is proof of that. So a couple of things. We know in 441, he went on a 40-day night pilgrimage to a place at the time that was known as Croagh Agla, which translates into Eagle Mountain. Today it's Croagh. And every year, thousands of people make the ascent, some barefoot, to commemorate the original one. Now, celebrations themselves began around the 9th century. And this was after the Vikings arrived in Ireland. And the Vikings arrived in Ireland and, they were violent against the church. Now, part of that was because what happened was around 795, the beginning of, the 8th century, that's when the Vikings started to come to Ireland. And that was at the time when Charlemagne, who had been made the Holy Roman, the head of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope, and he was given the job of Christianizing Europe. And what he did was he came out with an edict, and the edict essentially said to people in Europe, you got two choices. One is to convert, or the other is to die. And people in Viking areas of the world, which hadn't up to that stage been exposed to Christianity, like Ireland or Britain or Gaul, they saw that as an affront. And as far as they were concerned, this was something that had to be stopped. So when the Viking Age commenced, that's one of the reasons why they were so adamant and so violent against the Christians, communities and countries they went into. People then, once they started to attack all of the learning centres in Ireland, a lot of the people there headed to Europe, bringing all their books with them and all their students. And then once in Europe, they began then to see Patrick as a symbol, and they began to commemorate him. The other thing was, of course, when the Vikings arrived, they realized that Irish people gathered together in large numbers to celebrate the saints. And the Vikings raided and made off with thousands of Irish for the slave markets. I'm going to quickly go through some of this. So in the 9th century in Ireland, they started an annual 3-day observance of the anniversary. And again, this was a prayer. This was not social drinking and having a good time. So anyway, it took until Luke Wadding for the feast day to be put on the universal liturgical calendar. That was brought by Luke Wadding. So then St. Patrick's Day became a holy day of obligation for Roman Catholics in Ireland. But it was also a feast day for the Church of Ireland. Because remember, when Patrick was around, granted there were splits within the church, but the Reformation hadn't happened. So after the Reformation, Patrick then is celebrated by people within the divided church. So until the 1700s, Patrick's Day was celebrated predominantly in Ireland. From the 18th century onward, as a result of the penal laws in Ireland, some Irish people began to use St. Patrick's Day as a means of promoting Irish culture and tradition. And it was seen as an act of defiance because they were able to get out and put on their shamrocks. And that was an indication of the Irishness, because under the penal laws, any demonstration of you being Irish was punishable. But because the Church of Ireland and the Reformed Church were also celebrating, they really couldn't say a whole lot about the fact that everybody was celebrating. So they got away with that. Now, green ribbons and shamrocks have been worn on St. Patrick's Day's parades since at least the 1680s. And then the Friendly Brothers of St. Patrick, they adopted green as its colour, because originally it was blue. In 1903, it became an official public holiday in Ireland, and the Bank Holiday Act of 1903 was introduced, and they also introduced a law that required that public houses be closed on the 17th of March because the drinking had gotten out of hand. And that lasted until the 1970s. There were parades in Waterford. The first Paddy's Day parade was in 1903. And again, as an act of defiance, before Easter in 1916, the Irish Volunteers held parades throughout Ireland, and the authorities recorded 38 St. Patrick's Day parades involving 6,000 marchers. Almost half of them were said to be armed, and that was in defiance against the British. I'm just going to quickly go along here then. So we know he's well known and celebrated in the US. The world's first recorded St. Patrick's Day celebration was in St. Augustine in Florida in the year 1600. And that's according to Dr. Michael Franzisi's recent research in 2017. He discovered the first St. Patrick's Day parade was also in St. Augustine in 1601, because we've had lots of situations where people celebrated St. Patrick by, gatherings or whatever, but then parades started to accompany or replace those. Now, those were organized in the Spanish colony by the Irish vicar there, Richard Arton. Many believe still, but for a long time, they believe that the first meeting of Irishmen on American soil took place in Boston in 1737. Boston had its first parade in 1812. In New York, the first celebration was at the Crown and Thistle in 1756. And then it was in New York City that the first parade took place. And in 1762, Irish soldiers that were in the British Army marched through Manhattan. And then in Boston, Evacuation Day, which was March 17th, 1776, that saw the withdrawal of British troops and loyalists. And Washington's general orders for the day, he set the password and countersign for safe re-entry into the city as Boston and St. Patrick. And then Washington, he also then allowed his troops a holiday in 1780, and that became known as St. Patrick's Day Encampment of 1780. And we know then by the late 1860s, over a dozen American cities had large St. Patrick's Day parades. And of course, we know that the Irish were arriving in huge numbers, and by 10 years later, the Irish were the majority in the population of New York. One of the sad things that happened was St. Patrick's crozier, which was made of wood and it was decorated with all sorts of jewels. And it is said that it was called An Bacál Íosa, which translates as the staff of Jesus. And there are some people who say that he had been given that on a visit to the Middle East, and that it had been used by Jesus. But again, we also know that it was from the Annals of Ulster that and various other works in Ireland say that it was a symbol. The crozier was a symbol of his authority, and he had it elaborate. He had it, he had his goldsmith Assicus do all sorts of nice things with it. We get a description of it from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and who told us it was covered with gold and ordained with the most costly gems. And it was a national relic, and oaths and treaties were signed on it, and it survived many a thing, but it didn't survive the Reformation. It was tragically and sacrilegiously destroyed during Henry VIII's Reformation. At that time, it was taken out from Christ Church, and it was burnt in front of the church in Dublin. Now, the only nation outside of Ireland that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday is Montserrat. and it was first populated by Irish African slaves deported there beginning in the 1650s, around the time that Cromwell was forcing tens of thousands of people out of Ireland. Montserrat is nicknamed the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. So just to let you know, I teach Irish history courses because I want to get to you now to answer any questions you may have and have some discussion. I'll just quickly tell you about my upcoming classes in March and April. I have a website, irishhistory.online, and then I have an email there that you can contact me or through the library here. So on Thursdays in March, I'm doing the history of County Kildare, as well as the history of the 6 counties or Northern Ireland from 1980 to 1999. And then in April, I'm doing the history of County Offaly. And then I'm looking at the Republic of Ireland from 1998, from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement up to the present day. If you'd like a copy of this presentation, just let me or the library know. The movie I referred to earlier on, you can get it there. That's the link. There's a kids' movie as well. Here's my biography. There's lots of books. I'm sure the library there has some, but there's just some of the ones that you can have a look at. So I'll go back to you now.
That was great. Oh my gosh, I learned so much.
Sorry if I rushed the end of it there, but
okay, so is there going to be a quiz now? Will there?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Spot quiz.
Yeah. So we have some good questions. I have 4 questions to pose to you. That was excellent. Thank you very much for that. These are all from my friend Jean, who's been sending some questions here. The first one is, can Sean tell us more about pirates?
Yeah, the pirates in Ireland, the ones that were referred to at the beginning, I'm taking that's where the question came from. The Irish seeing the danger, the potential danger from the Romans being able to settle to Britain and gaining control of Britain. The fear was that then they would expand. So the Irish made alliances with the people of northern Britain, which would be the Picts and the Scots today, and also other communities in parts of Britain. Because remember, when the Romans came in, they didn't kill all the Celts that had been on the island of Britain. A lot of them were forced into areas of Britain. So the Irish would have been working with them. But the main thing they wanted to do was to destabilize so that that they would keep the Roman army so busy just defending all of their borders that they wouldn't have time to seriously consider coming and taking Ireland. So the Irish would go away, on their boats, and they would raid these communities and destroy the communities and take the people back to Ireland as slaves.
I didn't realize this. So, Jean, feel free to unmute yourself too as we go along with your questions. Okay. Okay, thank you. And so the second one is. Oh, Jean, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, very good. Did that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, that was cool. I had no idea they had Irish pirates.
Okay.
Yeah, well, there were raiders, I suppose more. They certainly, they're not pirates in the same way as the pirates of the Caribbean. They weren't that. They would have been working, as part of the kind of navy of Ireland is an island, and remember in those days there was no highways, so everybody operated on water. So. You had your ship, whether it was going up rivers or going across the sea. People had lots of skill. They mightn't have had the finest looking boats, but they could manage them, and they could read the sky.
Okay. All right.
Wow.
Next question that Jean had is that name Victorious a Roman/Latin name or Irish?
Victoria.
Yeah, it's probably the Latinized form of Victor. Victoricus wouldn't be. It's not an Irish name anyway. it's not the way, there's plenty of victors in Ireland. And I don't know whether the origin is in this Victoricus, but it's not a particularly Irish name. And certainly none of the victors that I know would appreciate being called Victoricus.
I think it's a nice, strong name. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it probably.
Actually, I looked about him except that he was a martyr.
Yes. So probably if you would find people with that name, they're probably members of the clergy. Everybody else is just simple old Victor.
Okay.
We're going to have a pint with Victor tonight, but
All
not
right.
with Victoricus.
All right, good. Yeah, thanks. And then the third question is, where did some of the asylum seekers come from?
Well, they would have come from Western Europe, from Gaul, which would be modern day France. They may also, depending on how far down, the Iberian Peninsula, because remember, quite a lot of Celts ended up, the Galatians that ended up in the Middle East. Galatians were Gauls. And St. Paul's letter to the Galatians was a letter, to them because they were Celts in the Middle East. So some of them went that way, and some of them, went to other places. Some of them came to Ireland.
Okay, Jean, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and then we have one more, Sean, which is, were they adult baptisms or babies?
There would be both. Like everybody at that stage, they would be largely baptizing, adults because, there was no history there before. So you would generally have to baptize the parents and then the kids.
Okay.
So, and I'm not too sure whether everybody got individually, doused, or whether there was some
Communal,
way managed to do a lot of people at the one time.
the whole family, yeah. Okay, very
The
interesting.
whole villages would come out, whole communities would come out. Yeah, because
Wow.
the strategy was, convert the leaders, and then the leaders would tell, the people, then you have to do this, and that was the way it worked. Didn't work the other way around,
I didn't realize there were so many slaves taken at that time.
Yeah, we've no idea what numbers there were, but there was considerable numbers. Like the population of Ireland around the 6th century was higher than at any time up to around the 19th century.
Very interesting. You're so knowledgeable.
Well, there was huge losses of people, like, between the 7th and the 9th centuries, we had, a plague that lasted about 250 years, so when you think of COVID,
Yeah.
They had a plague.
That's nothing compared to the plague, right? Oh my gosh.
So that decimated the population. And then in the 14th century, in the 1340s, Europe lost maybe 20 million people to the Black Plague.
Yeah, the Black Plague, right? Yeah. So does anyone else have a question for Mr.
Or a
Milton?
comment?
A comment, a question? Everyone's very quiet, Sean. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating history of this. There was a lot of detail there, and I learned a lot personally.
I'd send you a copy. I'd send you a copy of the presentation, and if anybody wants it,
yes, please. Please do, and I can forward it. If anyone wants to write me, I can forward that on to you, and I will use it too for. As I said, I'm filming this for cable, and I will use it for the cable. Milton Cable will use it when they put it up and edit it. So Maritza says thank you so much, and so does Shannon. And she said,
and if anybody's, if anybody is any interested in the history courses that I do, one of them is a complete chronological history of Ireland from, 340 million years ago, from the physical formation of Ireland up to the present day. And that's a series. The lectures are months. They're chunked into months, and it lasts about 3 years to get through the whole lot. But a lot of people don't do them all. Some people do, but there's no commitment. You can do a month at a time or a month once off or whatever. And then the other program I have is the history of each county. Like at the moment I'm doing County Kildare. Next month I'm doing County Offaly. So there's 32 counties. So that takes 3 years basically to get around.
Yeah, so if anyone has a family from a certain county, they'd probably be very interested in that. Shannon sent you a shamrock too. I think, did you see that? And Kelly says,
yeah, it came up there on the screen. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kelly says, thank you. My grandpa and I really enjoyed your talk. So,
well, that's wonderful. So happy St. Paddy's Day to you all.
Oh, yes. Thanks to you, to everyone. And thank you for being here. It was great to see everybody here with me. And okay, so I guess I will.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me to do this.
Oh, you're welcome. It was really enjoyable and so interesting and educational.
And maybe next year, maybe we could try the family of St. Patrick. Some very interesting family history.
Yeah, I will check out the rest of your programs, Sean.
Yeah.
And so anyway, thanks again to everyone. And I guess I'll see you next time. Good night. Good night.